5 minutes to our friend from Kansas, Ron Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Swagel, for being here today. The updated CBO baseline confirms some things that we've known for a while. We're at an economic and fiscal tipping point in this country. You know, every second we borrow another $90,000. So in the amount of time it took me to say $90,000, we borrowed another $90,000 and created this $34 trillion debt that's actually increasing at about $2.6 trillion if you look at the last year in terms of the amount of money that's been borrowed. And projections are that our deficit and our additional borrowing will increase by over 5% of GDP over the next several years. I'm going to vary off of what's on my prepared remarks, partly because of some comments that were made earlier, but partly just because to reflect on what's really going on. Yesterday, the Consumer Price Index, CPI, was reported for the month of January and went up. And the year-to-year went up. The month-to-month went up above projections and above previous months. And in fact, one of the things that was noted earlier today was that the actual interest costs on our debt went up an additional $9 billion yesterday just because interest rates went up because investors demand more money when inflation goes higher. And inflation's continuing to increase prices. You know, the amount of government spending over the last 3 years, when the Democrats were mostly in control, this splurge has resulted in actually now prices are 17.9% higher than what they were 3 years ago in January of 2021. And actually it has a drastic impact on the viability of us, our net debt, our net interest costs, as well as the overall concern about what we can afford. The Chairman mentioned earlier about defense, and the interest costs are going to be higher than what we're spending on defense, and as well as health and human services and agriculture and environment and everything else that we spend money on. So we've got to make some serious changes. You mentioned earlier that the Fiscal Responsibility Act helped bend the curve on some of that. Some of the other things that have been talked about earlier is that, you know, discretionary spending, the piece that we get to vote on every year, is less than 30% now of our actual spending versus the mandatory spending program. So we've got to do some work. The Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act that passed last week was a good bill to be helpful in terms of promoting economic growth to help keep our tax revenue coming in. You know, if we implement some of the policies to boost the economy and revenues, will we still have to cut spending in order to improve our nation's fiscal health?
Yes, sir. I mean, even with the strong economy, the policies that you know, the strong economy you have in mind, we still need to take action to adjust our fiscal trajectory.
And I mentioned automatic spending, but as much as we're spending now on interest, which is falling into that automatic spending category, can you share how much of a percentage of our budget is spent on interest and how that's going to change over the next few decades, and what's the impact?
So in some sense, that's a key challenge, is that what we spend on net interest now is roughly equal to either defense or non-defense discretionary spending, a little bit below one, a little bit above other. Over the next 10 years, those interest payments are rising by so much that they're like 1.5 times the either defense or non-defense. And that is just an illustration of the point that you're making, that interest payments will just crowd out everything else in the budget.
And another question I've got is, does the CBO baseline account for some drastic differences in estimates? I know there were some comments made earlier about the process and what's used, and how do we ensure greater accuracy? I mean, there's other estimators out there, whether it's Penn Morton, whether it's University of Chicago, on key pieces of legislation like the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which obviously the numbers were completely off based on the baseline estimate. So how do we reconcile and come back with better answers through that?
So we do our best to be in some sense in the middle of the range of possible outcomes, and we know there's uncertainty about all of our outcomes. we consult with outside experts, our panel of advisors. Ultimately, it's on us to, as you say, go back and look at what we've done, where we've got it wrong, and if there's a way for us to improve our process.
Well, I know you mentioned people and money, but I mean, there may be some of those other models to look at to incorporate, to utilize as well. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman